All right, let's see if the microphone is working. Can we hear? Okay, good. Very good. Okay, so let's review for everyone in calendar what's coming up. So today is our lecture, and then the rest of the day is a studio day. 15th is a studio day as well. So you basically have the rest of this week to work on your project. As far as like casting, assembling, the construction part of it. On the 20th, there's an in-progress critique, and that's your last day that we're going to have in class for you to work on construction or assembly or anything like that, taking in feedback. And you need to have your project ready to be painted, which means that it not only needs to be constructed, but your glue needs to be dried and your plaster needs to have a chance to dry out as well, because it's not fun to paint on wet. It's gonna behave a little bit funky. So I recommend you have yourself ready for painting by the 22nd at the very least. We'll be setting up individual spotlights for everybody to use to illuminate their artwork so that they can paint it. So we have that coming up. Also this week, so for Sunday, you have two things. You've got your check-in 13. It's an in-progress check-in. You just got to take a picture of your work in progress and give me an update on it. And you have a worksheet. The worksheet is based on today's lectures. If you wanted to, you could pull up that worksheet right now and have a look at the questions that are going to be asked on it to make sure that you've got the answers for it straight from the horse's mouth during the lecture. So that right there is worksheet 8. It's going to cover pattern, rhythm, and repetition. It's going to cover artistic practice, and it's going to cover some material and medium analysis. And then the check-in right there as well. Does anyone have questions about due dates for projects or anything like that for the rest of this week at least? Good. Just an alert for those of you who are like in the point where you're thinking about your final exam schedule, because we got less than a month till finals are done and over and we can all breathe a little bit. I'm going to open up our final for you on the 3rd, and our final day, like our assigned day of finals is on the 6th. So you'll have from the 3rd until the 6th at midnight to complete the final exam. It's structured just like the midterm is, only it covers more information than the midterm does. It's open note, and you have as much time as you want to within those 3 or 4 days. I mean, it's timed, but you have the time to set aside any time between the 3rd and the 6th at midnight. You can take the final online through D2L, and that'll wrap you up here. Any other questions? And let me check in right here. Anyone have any more questions about that stuff? Mm-hmm. All right, good. Okay, so when is this project due? This project is due on our last day that we will be meeting together as a class, which is Thursday the 29th. So that on that day, you'll bring in your project completed. You'll submit your artist statement by midnight online. And then you will also need to, before you leave, you are going to document that work. I think it's Sunday, wrong month. Sunday, May the 2nd, right here. You just have to, that's the final deadline for you to submit the documentation of your work. So you have to take a picture and edit it of your artwork. And I've given you some lessons on editing documentation as well. That's not going to be part of your project grade. It's going to be a worksheet grade. It's going to replace one of the worksheets that we skipped this semester since we skipped project 4. Let's see. Other questions? Oh, I just talked about dates for us. So basically you have a worksheet and a check-in this week. If you feel like you want to review it, there will be a posting of this video later if you want to go back and watch like the first 5 minutes of it. Mostly it's just concerning dates. Other questions? All right. So if no one has any more questions, then I'm going to go ahead and begin the lecture. If you're online and you have a question in the middle of the lecture, you need to use the raise hand feature because I'm not going to be able to see the chat room. So just make sure that you understand that. And we're going to pop in. Yes. The last day for construction, calendar. The last day for August. The last day for construction is going to be the 20th. We'll have 2 days. Yes, and after that's painting. So you have 2 full studio days to work on the painting. If you get done earlier and you want to start on the painting earlier, that's totally fine. You're more than welcome to come in and I'll set you up with a light. We'll get you a directional spot. But you have until the 20th to work on the construction. Any other questions? All right. Now we're going to go into our presentation. So even though I wrote this presentation for the Mandala project, it's an important and essential part of being in Foundation. You can definitely use this information and these considerations with your current project and with projects in the future. Like the point of this class is to teach you, you are learning how to learn. You are learning how to think. You are building an artistic practice. More than the end goal of any one particular project, what you want to be thinking about is how can you be using this to learn how to communicate visually more effectively and how you can use the practice of making and creating as part of building a healthy lifestyle as well. So first thing we're going to talk about, balance. So balance can be achieved by the even distribution of weight in a composition. That can include the actual weight of something, so how much it weighs physically and how it's affected by gravity. But it can also be in terms of the visual weight or how much it draws the eye towards any particular element of a composition. Not every composition has to be balanced. You can make a composition or a construction unbalanced if you are trying to achieve that kind of mood. But if you are doing that, then you need to be going about it intentionally. So we're going to be considering all of the applications of balance in your work. Probably most practically for you guys in this particular project, especially with 3D work, is you need to be thinking about balance and actual weight, or the physical weight of your materials in pounds or grams. If you make your particular project too heavy in this assignment, you may find that it pulls itself off the wall. So you need to be considering of your materials. You need to be considering your adhesives as well and the impact of gravity. So you want to be testing the balance of this project as you are going along and constructing it, so that you don't get the whole thing done and you've never put it on the wall before, and the first time you put it on, it just flops right off, or a piece falls off or something like that. So you want to take time to consider the actual weight of your work. The Spoon Bridge and Cherry is impressive because it looks like it defies balance, but it actually took a lot of work for the artists and their engineers that worked with them to create balance of the sculpture, because it weighs several tons. So actual weight and how to balance that can be part of your artistic practice. As an artist, you are not merely a visual communicator. Sometimes you're an engineer. Sometimes you're a mathematician. Sometimes, you have to be a politician. Sometimes you have to be a a manager and all those kind of things. You might be wearing various hats on your head during the course of your career as a visual communicator. So it's best to kind of prepare yourself for it now. Get used to the idea and the thought of it, because it's going to happen. If you want to achieve success, you got to be flexible. A great artist who uses balance in his artworks would be Calder. His mobiles, especially because they are moving compositions, so compositions that change over time, and they're made of steel rods and sheet metal. He has to take into account the physical balance of the actual weight of his pieces in order to create a successful composition. So a great example of balance in work and the physical actual weight of a piece needing to be considered in order for the artist's vision to be successful. Then we've got visual weight. So we talked about the actual physical weight, but sometimes in the composition you might have instances of visual weight, and you'll have them in this composition that you've got right now. So the visual weight is the apparent lightness or heaviness of elements of your composition. So there are different things that you can do to your parts of your composition in order to lighten them or to make them feel heavier. The heavier something is, the more it draws the eye to it. So if you have a particularly heavy aspect of your composition, it draws the eye, it catches the eye, and it's almost like you're stuck and you have to notice it, you have to look at it. It's very akin to emphasis. So in order to make something compositionally heavier, there's several things that you can do to manipulate it. One thing you can do to make something visually heavier is you can boost the saturation or the intensity. The more bright, kind of neon-y that a color is, the more it hooks your eye, the more attention that you're going to give to it, the heavier it feels in the composition, the more almost like a black hole or gravity, the more it kind of sucks in the energy. Deepening your value can also increase the weight of your composition. So the darker in value it becomes, the more it feels to sink in, the more it feels like it's kind of drawing. So if you have a particularly heavy chunk of your composition, or a particularly dark chunk of your composition, thinking about like maybe someone's using chiaroscuro, then the darker part is visually quite heavier. And then there are just some hues that are inherently light or heavy. One of the heaviest hues, or the heaviest hue, again, we learned about this in emphasis, due to our associations with blood, is red. The redder something is, the more we tend to focus on it, the more it draws the eye to it. That's why in the composition, most of the times we are cautioned to limit the amount of red that we put into something. The more that you overwhelm your composition with that especially intense color, or if you were overwhelming it with super saturated colors or something like that, the more overwhelming it feels to your audience, the more powerful and overpowering it can be. And sometimes when you use a ton of red in the composition, it just feels overwhelming, overly powerful. And what you may have to do is you may need to tone down the redness in elements so that only the part that you want to focus on gets that full, intense redness. And you let everything else be subordinated or lightened down, either by lowering the saturation, lightening the value, or maybe like using other cues to help you out. So if you are in a composition and you find that people are paying attention to one part of the composition, but they're not focusing on your focal point, maybe that means that your focal point lacks weight, or that other things in your composition have too much weight. And so you can do some things to kind of create more weight on your focal point by increasing the heaviness, or reduce attention on your non-focal point by lightening the heaviness on it. So many ways to achieve balance. We'll look at those all in a little bit more depth. But a great way to think about it is if you treat visual weight as a metaphor for physical weight, and you think about it like a balance beam. So if I put two objects on either side of my balance beam or my seesaw, and they're exactly the same and they're in the same spot on opposite sides of one another, then I know it's going to achieve balance because I've treated it evenly. The same thing if I wanted to choose two objects of similar visual impact, but maybe aren't exactly the same. The similar visual impacts will balance each other out as well. So that's that second one. Then we can look at some instances of asymmetrical balance, or how we can achieve balance without necessarily making it one here mirrors the other on the other side. Ways to do that is to consider the positioning versus the scale. So more impactful things in the center of your composition can be balanced by smaller things towards your edge. The closer you get to the edge of your composition, the more tension is created visually in your art. So that visual tension draws the eye to it. It's why if you are a graphic designer, you're doing any typography, they say never like butt a line of text right up to the edge of a bounding box or anything like that. That's tension that you're creating visually. You want to avoid like putting text right against edges. You want to give it a little white space in between. Oh, I went too far. So that can help you with that. That mouse is so sensitive. And then the other thing you can do is you can balance one very heavy, visually heavy object with multiple smaller, visually less impactful objects. Let's explore all this. Like I said, a balance can be achieved both symmetrically and asymmetrically. Both of these buildings are balanced, but one is symmetrical and one is asymmetrical. Symmetrical just means that along some kind of axis, or from your center point if it's radiating out, you can divide the composition or the construction across that line, and what happens on one side is reflected onto the other side. It corresponds or it correlates. Great example, Taj Mahal. Minaret on the left, minaret on the right. Hedges on the left, hedges on the right. Dome on the left, dome on the right. Very symmetrical, easy way to achieve balance. But just because asymmetrical balance is trickier doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So St. Basil's right there, a composition that can't be divided into sections that reflect one another. There's no way to cut the cathedral in half and have exactly on the left the same as the right, but balance is still being achieved by creating similar moments of visual interest. So even though you can't really cut it in half, there's still enough moments of visual complexity throughout this, enough repetition of similar shapes going on throughout, that even though it's not symmetrical, it still feels balanced. It still feels like your distribution of weight is even. So, just to reiterate, asymmetrical balance does not mean a work is unbalanced. Unbalanced gives you feelings of something being off, something being maybe wrong, something being uncertain or unstable or uneasy, as opposed to asymmetrical balance, which still has a lot of harmony. You're just achieving it in non-symmetrical ways. So in this case, the rescue of Andromeda by Perseus from the Kraken. This is a Baroque Rococo era artwork. You can see the influence of Japan and trade with the Far East in this representation of the Kraken, which is a Greek animal, but it's drawn very much like a Chinese dragon / water serpent. So you can see that there's definitely some Asian influence going on in this work. But you have right here your focal point. What really draws your eye is the very pale figure of Andromeda. Her scale, her closeness, that tension between her and the edge of the artwork all draw your eye to her. But she is a very smooth expanse of skin. There's not a lot of texture going on with her. And so she is balanced out by smaller secondary focal points, if you want to say, that are much more colorful, much more textured. And so those multiple smaller elements help to balance out the composition, even though it's not necessarily done through symmetry. It's more of this last one right here. All right. So if you are choosing symmetry, though, there are a couple different types of symmetry that you can choose to work with. First is bilateral symmetry. Just like I talked about, if you were to fold this triptych in half along the line that goes through the Madonna, you would see corresponding relationships on the halfway point. But notice that not every piece with bilateral symmetry is necessarily going to have what we call absolute symmetry or exact symmetry. There are corresponding parts here, but unlike the Taj Mahal, they differ slightly and they have uniqueness. Each saint is wearing different robes and has a different appearance. Each angel, the same thing, slightly different position, slightly different robes. Within the windows, there are different views that change as we go about. So it has bilateral symmetry, but it's not an absolute symmetrical piece. Just like every square is a rectangle, but not every rectangle is a square, if you remember that from geometry class. The same thing goes with bilateral symmetry. Everything that has absolute symmetry will have bilateral symmetry, but not every piece that has bilateral symmetry is necessarily absolute. Absolute is like a butterfly's wings. Unless the butterfly has, had an accident with something that's tried to eat it, it's going to have exactly the same pattern on each wing. And that's a great example of absolute symmetry. The Rorschach ink blot tests are also good examples of absolute symmetry. Each half of the composition appears exactly the same. And then the last type of symmetry we're going to look at for this class is going to be radial symmetry. And so radial symmetry comes from a central point, radiates outwards like the spokes of a wheel, slices of pie, mandalas, of course, radial symmetry, Gothic windows, radial symmetry, or rose windows, I guess we would call them. So rose windows being being radial symmetry. And you can think about how these different kinds of symmetries, whether it's bilateral or radial, give your piece a certain kind of mood or feeling. Symmetry and balance, what does that do? It feels kind of predictable and stable and ordered. It feels, like things belong, where there's a certainty to it. And so pieces that have very strict bilateral symmetry or strict radial symmetry tend to be artworks that are communicating to you ideas of balance, of harmony in life, of communicating messages, of things being as they ought to, or proper progressions with beginning, middles, and ends. With radial, it might be a more cyclical, complete feeling. The circle for humans is a sign of completeness in pretty much every culture. The circle when you complete a circle or a circular thing, it has this inherent feeling that it gives you of being complete or whole. Okay, so we hit balance. Let's talk about pattern, rhythm, and repetition, those three elements, and how they are useful to you in your artwork and how they each can communicate certain messages or feelings. So, repetition, pattern, and rhythm are all elements of repeating. They are elements of using the multiple. So repetition takes the multiple, it just slaps it on there a bunch of different times. It doesn't try to change it, doesn't try to move it or anything like that. It's very predictable. It's very much the same thing enforced, as opposed to pattern, which is a repetition, but it's a repetition of a set amount of elements in a predictable matter. So once I've seen a pattern one time, I know what's going to come next. You get the chunk of the pattern, the base of it, and you can predict what's going to happen, as opposed to rhythm, which rhythm is not random. So rhythm is not random, but it's also not repetition. It is a set amount of predictable factors that you are going to repeat in a way that suggests movement or dynamism or change. How do you create that idea? By not necessarily knowing exactly what's going to come next. I know that at some point in this composition, I'm going to see a yellow triangle come again, but is the yellow triangle going to be the next shape? Is it going to be the third shape? Is it going to be the fifth shape? I don't know. It's coming, but I'm not sure. And that uncertainty that you give your audience indicates to them, hey, this is about to change. This is dynamic. There's progress happening. So let's look at examples of each of those. Repetition, that copying of a compositional element over and over again with little to no change to it. Joho Sue's monuments and memorials are a great way to look at repetition as a symbol of cultural factors. So Joho Sue's a Korean artist, and Asian art and Asian approaches to community and to culture are very different from what we have learned in America, especially, and in the West. In America, the individual is kind of king. We really prize uniqueness. We prize and prioritize creating something that represents you as an individual, your style, and all that kind of stuff. But not all cultures are that way. Not all cultures are individual-centric. There are many cultures that are community-centric as a contrast. So in this particular monument you have right here, what is a monument? A monument is a celebration of achievement. So you have this monument, this blank symbol for achievement being lifted up by these small, anonymous, repeated figures. And so what that happens is that the needs or the many outweigh the needs of the few in this particular thing. And it shows how large-scale achievements that would inspire things like memorials, especially in Eastern culture, are often created by the community acting as one anonymously rather than one single hero coming through and lifting it up. The same thing can be seen for these ones where it's the figure standing under a plate of glass. In this case, the anonymous many that have worked and gone through life and made the world that is constructed so that you can be lifted up today. You are standing on the work of many, many, many people, many of whom you'll never even know what they did in order to get you to the point where you are. Then we've got rhythm. It's that achievement when an element of art is repeated to stimulate movement. Here we have Henri Matisse, who has repeated 5 red figures. They've all been treated very similarly, except for one thing. One thing is unique about each of them, and that is how they are positioned in the composition. So this unpredictable undulating, it's not a pattern because everyone's not moving, in the same way each different time. And it's just repeating over and over the 3 sets of different movements. Each specific person is unique. If you had a 6th person in here, I would know some things that I could predict about it, but I couldn't predict what it would look like in terms of its position or where it stood in the composition. And it's that unpredictability and that movement and that change that leads the eye in this circular motion throughout the composition that kind of echoes the rhythm of dancing. And rhythm in art or visual art is very similar to rhythm in music theory in that it keeps you moving, it keeps you going. So repetition in your work often indicates that the work is static. It doesn't really indicate action because all you're doing is you're repeating the same thing over and over again. So that same element coming up again and again and again without change is very predictable. So I know that it's going to indicate a work that is talking about things that are stable, that are safe, that are not really indicative of change. It could be stagnant. It could be, kind of sluggish or stuck in its own ways if you wanted to pull it to a negative, but it could also be reliable. It could be something that is, dependable or stable. Thinking about the pyramids in Egypt and how those static forms were quite reliable and comforting to the subject. As opposed to rhythmic work, which indicates a work that is dynamic. So that visual change gives you the illusion of movement. It symbols progress. It symbols motion in a forward or backwards direction. It could be forwards or it could be backwards. But it can also be, because it's dynamic, it could be fragile. It could be, unstable as well. There's many interpretations that can come out of it. So, let's hear, is this a better example of repetition or of rhythm? I'd say repetition. Where's the movement for you? Okay, so the changing of colors from one to one. So maybe in the entire exhibition, yeah, there could be some rhythm from room to room in terms of like undulations of colors. Within the objects themselves, though, I might be leaning more towards repetition because within this one piece as it acts on its own, the only thing that changes with this is just the position of it. The actual treatment of the individual pieces is pretty stable and pretty stagnant. I definitely could see, though, that there being a rhythm from room to room of the different pieces. So they both are dealing with the repetition of elements, and it's how you can interpret the movement in it that gives you that additional idea of rhythm. And then let's talk about pattern. To me, pattern is like the most personal of all of the elements and principles because it's so closely associated with textile, especially. And we tend to see pattern in things that can be modular. So textiles are modular in that they are based around the module of the individual thread, and it's how you arrange those individual colors of thread that gives you patterns in textiles. The same thing can be said for mosaics. Mosaics are built around the module. So it's how you arrange each individual color of tile that gives you a mosaic pattern. Kente cloth from Ghana is a particular example of textile pattern that tells a story. Now, pretty much every textile pattern has a cultural story to it, whether it's the houndstooth from Scotland or tartan from Scotland, whether it's paisley from Persia. polka dots and checks that originally came from China. But kente cloth in particular has a lot of significance. And when you are a member of the original culture that this comes from, you don't just wear any kente cloth because you like the pattern of it that day and that's what you want to wear. You wear the different patterns because the arrangement of shapes and colors have been made to tell a specific story. And that story is appropriate for a certain occasion or a certain status. So not every single person is going to wear the same, is going to be available to the same kente pattern for every occasion. You're going to have specific patterns that go with specific occasions and are used by specific people. And then, of course, we have patterning in tiles and mosaics. It's especially popular in places that are under or have been touched by Islamic influences. Places like Morocco, we really know well for the tile work. Byzantium, South Asia as well. All of those places have been southern Spain as well. A lot of those places have Islamic influence, and as a result, have a lot of patterning in tile work. And the reason why this happens is Islamic art, as well as early Christian and some Christian sects, and there are some other religions as well, they all practice this artistic restriction of aniconism. And so that is the restriction of depicting either humans or sometimes animals, or sometimes it's only the religious figures in their artwork. And so because there is a restriction imposed upon the depiction of humans and animals, artists often choose to turn to things like calligraphy, patterns based on vegetation or geometry to find a way to express beauty without necessarily reverting to creating images, which can either be seen as creating a false idol or imitating the role of God or Allah as a creator. So because there is a restriction on the types of images that can be made in these artworks, pattern really comes to the forefront, especially through mosaics. And we've seen for ourselves, and you probably feel this all the time, pattern is, and doodling pattern is a very instinctive, very satisfying expression for the human condition. We like to make order out of things. We like things that make sense. We like things that have aesthetic appeal and balance and predictability, and doodling patterns really fits into that. It scratches that itch that we have, that desire to create a little bit of order, to create a little bit of predictability and reliability, and a little bit of aesthetic pleasingness, which is why we did that Zentangle project this past week. All right, medium. Medium is the material your artist chooses to work with alongside that accompanying technique. So that's two different things, though. So it's not just your material, it's also how you use your material. So both of these are ceramics, but they're two different mediums. One, the medium is earthenware, that's the material, like terracotta. Then the technique is hand building, as opposed to here, the medium is porcelain, which is a kaolin, originally comes from China. And then their technique is to throw on the potter's wheel. A lot of times, the reasons why people pick traditional sculpture media has a lot to do with longevity and durability. So most of our traditional sculptural media is media that is either easy to work with for some sort of aspect, or it's readily available, or it is extremely durable. Things like ceramic and glass are silica-based, which don't degrade over time. There's nothing that oxidizes them. There's nothing that corrodes them. So they will stay impermeable to the ravages of time. Metals, while they are very hard and they are durable, and some of them corrode less likely than others, Many metals will corrode over time, but that is why gold has been so important to so many cultures. That's why everybody values gold more than anything else, is because gold is both malleable and moldable and workable, and it's also non-corrosive, which means that as a material, not only does it like have a lot of good qualities that ensure that your artwork will last a long time, but it also has heavy symbolic value. So the incorruptibility and the lack of decay of gold is what makes it a beautiful metaphor for most cultures' religious artworks. That incorruptibility relates to purity that a lot of people feel for their highest spiritual connections or their spiritual figures as well. It's why you see gold leaf on medieval artworks of the Madonna. That's why you see golden Buddhas as well. So that gold is a material that we prize not only for its features, but what it symbolizes as well. Let's talk about some non-traditional media, though. Just because there are traditional sculptural medias doesn't mean that you have to be beholden to them for the rest of your life. There's plenty of meaning to be had in non-traditional media. Andy Goldsworthy, a great environmental artist who works with non-traditional nature-found materials. And even though some of his are, you know, a little bit more durable, like rocks and pebbles, many of his artworks are made from things that are specifically non-durable, whether it's leaves or even as fragile as ice, and they don't last very long. And so that lack of durability for your artwork is what sends a message for his pieces. So the fact that he chooses materials that are going to decay or wither or melt helps to make his point, which is that human doesn't have an impact on the earth. We come, we move, we make, we change, we bend that chaos to the will of our order. But at the end of time, you know, from dust to dust, nature wins. Nature comes back. It takes over. We are still, at this point, we haven't gotten past it yet. We are still susceptible and bound to the laws of the world and the laws of nature. We will eventually, even everything that we have made and created is eventually going to go back and return to the state that it once was. Kara Walker's, it's got two names. It's called A Subtlety, and also, let me pop out real quick. I'm going to make sure I know what the other name is. It's Kara Walker. Oh, I guess the other, Sugar Baby, that's right. Sugar Baby was the second name, which gives you a hint at what the material is made of. So this one called A Subtlety the name refers to the fact that in like the 19th century Victorian times, when you had a really important guest over to your table, you would present them with a sugar dessert that was made in like a really kind of fancy mold or something like that, and it would be called a subtlety. So by calling it that, indicating service and consumption, and by creating a sphinx in the shape of what is like the traditional mammy figure, and making that sphinx out of sugar and putting it in the old domino factory, Kara Walker is creating a commentary, a very, very strong social commentary, talking about consumption and the kind of use and consumption of, yes, go ahead. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, they have, and you can watch some videos of it. They've got like pictures of people after they've like done the carving on it being like blown off with air blowers from all the sugar dust and stuff like that. It's really It's very interesting. And so she's making a lot of messages about consumption and unseen service. And of course, then you also have like the idea of like sugar and like how it's kind of empty calories, both very sweet and satisfying, but also not really that great for you. So there's a lot of layers and messages and meanings that are happening to it. And one of the like big foundations that sinks you into it or that grabs you is the material that's being made of and the fact that it's not a traditional material. If this had been made out of, no, don't go to sleep. Hold on. If this had been made of limestone, like the original Sphinx, it would have had a completely different meaning than if it was made of sugar. Okay, we're gonna watch a quick video, right quick here. Let me see, I may have to pull my, let me see if it'll work. Nope, it's in my earphones. Hold on one second. I don't want to turn them off yet. Let me see if that'll do it. There we go. Okay, so a great example, let me put the music or put the sound back into here so I can hear. So a great example of an artwork that is made of non-traditional materials that would lose meaning if, where is I? Can you go back on the full screen? That would lose meaning if it was just made out of paint, because all those individual pieces represent the individual actions of the nurses as they care for their patients and their relationship to the patient. So non-traditional media often has very personal meaning and connections that can be imbued with it that aren't just going to come in the same way if you make your artwork out of paint or out of wood or out of something that you had no connection to until you went and bought it in the store. The fact that these pieces of or these objects were interacted with as part of people's lives gives them more meaning. Another artist who works sometimes with non-traditional media, sometimes with traditional media, is Ai Weiwei, who you may know being the artist who dropped the Han Dynasty urn and documented it. He was the architect behind the Bird's Nest, which was the stadium for the 2010 Beijing Olympics. It was definitely the Beijing Olympics. I'm not 100% sure about which year it was. But that really beautiful stadium he created. He's also extremely socially and politically active, very critical of the Chinese government, and is under indefinite house arrest for that. And as such, has a team of artists around the world who sometimes help to distribute his artworks. He made a series of artworks this particular year to go to the COVID Relief Fund. And just by making the work on a mask, regardless of like even getting to the point where we're addressing the imagery, we already have a lot of emotions, a lot of connections to it. We have a lot of things that we bring to the table as the audience when we interact with something on non-traditional media like a mask. And if you'd like to see one in person, you can come up here and look at it. Just make sure your hands are clean. And you can also read his card if you'd like to as well, where he talks more about his work and what this particular artwork is meaning, what he's talking about. But just the fact that he's making work on a non-traditional material like a mask gives a lot of charged meaning to it than if it was done on just a piece of rag paper, a traditional printmaking cloth. And like you kind of saw in that last one, artists can use non-traditional materials to make a lot of socially and politically charged commentary, especially considering that we live in a consumer culture, a culture that is all about objects and gaining things and acquiring things over and over again. The objects of our consumption can be used to send very powerful political messages. This is a great example of an artwork whose materiality or lack thereof, the sort of ephemerality of it, is very effective in sending the message. So the Tribute in Light, dedicated to the 9/11 memorial and incident, is a wonderful example of how we have taken the aesthetic of something that was once physical and transposing it to something ephemeral sends home a message. So in the spot where the Twin Towers once stood, now it used to be a lot longer. Now I think it's just every year on the same day on 9/11. They post very bright vertical stitch lights that go up into the sky. And so by translating those physical towers that held physical people with their lives at that particular time, translating that now to a light tower is a great way to show the transition of that building and those lives into now our remembrance and our memory. It is now no longer a physical, tangible thing. It is now a thing that we hold in our memories, in our hearts, in our recollections of the people and that place. And also the fact that it is vertical helps to tie into our ideas of alertness and remembrance. And the fact that it goes up unending into the sky also can have spiritual connotations as well. So it's a great translation of mediums in order to send a new message. All right. And the last thing we're going to look at today is, in addition to like your materials, because medium is not just the material, it's also the practice of making. We're going to look at some instances of artistic practice that can be helpful to you. I'm not necessarily saying that you need to start meditating every day or anything like that, but it can be helpful to look at how other people employ artistic practice and what the artistic practice can do for you. Because sometimes it's not the end goal. That's the point of your artwork. Sometimes it's not the destination, it's the journey. You know, sometimes what you get out of an artwork is not necessarily your final product, it's the process of making it. Whether that is the process of making it teaching you something, or whether the process of making it is just cathartic to you. You don't want to lose the joy. What up, Simeon? What? What are you doing? What? Okay. Anyways, so it can be very cathartic as well. So I want you to be mindful of your artistic practice. If your artistic practice is something that stresses you out every single time you try to make anything, that's not really healthy, for one, and you're going to burn out for another. Like, if you can't find anything to connect to or to enjoy or to experience on something, like, maybe what you're doing isn't right for you. You need to think about that. So we're going to explore some ways in which artistic practice is being used through the mandala. Oh, the video volume. Let's see. Let's try that. There we are.
Good morning. And this morning, I'd like to invite you to do something really fairly special. I'd like to invite you to enter the mandala. That is, enter a room we here at the as a workshop. Now, the first question when you come to mind is, precisely what is a mandala? Well, this can be approached in several different ways. You can approach it through the language. A mandala is a power, and the law is hidden present, usually in the center of that power. So it's a power contained within. In another sense, in a geometric sense, a mandala is a set of massive squares and circles, a journey through which takes you to that center of the mandala. But most importantly, mandala is a meditative environment. It's reconstructed not usually architecturally, as we said here, but rather in the mind's eye. Measure for success in mandala meditation is if you can see a vision of that mandala, of meditative squares and circles, in mind for 2 straight hours without wavering. Side, tip of your nose, you've achieved success in entered the mandala. We think we may be able to use our gallery space to give you, the visitor, an experience of being inside the meditative geometry of the mandala without 20 years of meditation practice.
So that brief introduction to how the mandala kind of fits into meditative practice can be a good starting point for you to think about how your artistic practice is, which is so it's the mandala, you are using either the creation of or the exploration of a series of geometric circles and squares going into one another, and by concentrating on that alignment to achieve a new meditative space. And you can come at your artistic practice in a very similar way, coming at it as you are focusing on the artwork, you can achieve a sense of being present in the moment. And that's something I would encourage you to consider with your artistic practice, is how can you achieve your practice while being present in the moment, not worrying about tomorrow or what what your next test is going to be, or how is this going to fit into X, Y, or Z, but looking at your artistic practice as a time for you to be fully present in that particular moment, to achieve that sense of just focus right now on what is happening right now, enjoying that moment, learning from that moment, all of that kind of stuff. Sometimes You know, we get really filled up with a bunch of different thoughts and a bunch of different things that are happening all at once. And sometimes it can really be beneficial for you to slow down, take a moment, be present in that moment, and move on from there. Come on, not now. Okay, this last video I'm gonna play after we hang up with the Teams people because it's about a 10-minute video and I want us to watch it, you know, in one go. Sometimes, like I said, it is a good idea to just stop and enjoy the process of something being created, whether that's you creating it, whether you're watching something else be created as well. So we're going to watch about 9 minutes of some monks creating a sand mandala. The sand mandala is great, even though like the reason why the Buddhist monks are making it has a lot more deeper spiritual significance than what I'm touching on right now. I still think that there are things that can be learned from it. And remember that art is subjective, so that like what it means to one person doesn't have to mean the same thing to the next person. You can apply it in your own different ways. What I like to take from things like the sand mandala is like, even if it's not necessarily about impermanence, it's a great lesson in that not every artwork is about the end goal. It's not about trying to save and preserve every single thing that you ever make. Some things you are going to make and you are going to let go into the world. Some things you're going to make and you never know what will happen to them. Some things you're going to make and you may ceremonially destroy them or deconstruct them. Those are all fine. It is part of the process of letting go. And I think we often get kind of stuck on wanting to hold on to every single thing that we've done so far. And sometimes the healthier thing, not all the time, not every single thing do you have to get rid of, but sometimes the healthy thing is to let something go. The healthy thing is to like say, hey, you know what, I've had this for a time. I've learned from it what I needed to learn from it. And now I'm going to let it go. So before we do that, I'm just going to let people in the chat have a chance for any questions before we head out. Basically, you've got this lecture. It should help you be able to do your worksheet 8. Remember, there is no worksheet 7 for this class, or for the now. I canceled worksheet 7. So we're moving on to worksheet 8, and you do have eventually check-in 13 as well. Does anyone have questions before we go? All right, so I'm going to hang up then with the people online. I'll post this video for people to review later on once the recording process is, which might be an hour or so. All right, so I'm going to hang up with the online people, and then we're going to play that video.